A delicate dance is playing out in Minnesota with the possible invocation of the Insurrection Act by the president. On the one hand, Governor Walz has mobilized the Minnesota National Guard so that they're on the ready in case he wants to deploy them to help keep the peace. On the other hand, the President of the United States and Secretary Hegseth have put on alert 1,500 paratroopers of the 11th Airborne Division out of Alaska in case they want to deploy them to Minnesota. What I think is an important data point to introduce into the conversation is a letter from the Solicitor General of the United States to the U.S. Supreme Court recently that strongly favors the use of the National Guard, not the use of the standing army. So let me just read you what President Trump's Solicitor General said to the Supreme Court explicitly. And he said that the president could reasonably determine that the standing military, quote, would significantly impede execution of the federal immigration laws because the standing military is less well suited than the National Guard to perform such protective functions on the streets of American cities. After all, the standing military's primary function is to win wars by deploying lethal force against foreign enemies, whereas the National Guard traditionally helps to keep the peace among the citizenry during domestic disturbances. So you can understand what he's saying there. It is the Trump administration's position to the Supreme Court that the National Guard is much better fit for purpose for handling domestic disturbances. It would strongly suggest that it would be inappropriate to invoke the Insurrection Act to bring in the active duty military rather than let Governor Walz, do the job if he needs to do the job, if circumstances require it, with the National Guard. And I'll just continue a little bit more with the letter from the Solicitor General, because we know from Pete Hegseth that this is in fact the way that he has kind of socialized the U.S. military to behave in terms of the active duty military. So the Solicitor General said, quote, in fact, one of respondents' own witnesses, a retired Army general, stated that soldiers in the standing army have an aggressive mindset because their mission is to destroy the enemy, not to prevent the confrontation and reduce the use of lethal force. The nature of the violent opposition encountered may have led the president to conclude that the National Guard, not the standing military, is uniquely adapted to achieve the protective mission. The president could reasonably have determined that the members of the National Guard, with their greater local knowledge, ties to the community, and domestic focus, would be more effective than active duty soldiers in addressing those threats. Period. End quote. That's the Trump administration's Solicitor General saying to the U.S. Supreme Court reasons as to why the National Guard is much better than the active duty military to inject themselves into a situation of civil disturbances inside the United States. In other words, undermining the very basis for invoking the Insurrection Act and rather leaving it with state-level governors with their National Guards using their local forces if the circumstances arise.